As Jujutsu Kaisen continues to soar in popularity, more and more claims of its mediocrity appear all around the internet too. Inevitably, upon seeing it pretty much everywhere, as well as on high places in some anime rankings, some people call it overrated and attribute its success to pretty much just the animation. Is it true though? A lot of the criticism I see doesn't feel fair to me, and in some cases it even seems like people are completely misunderstanding certain characters' personalities or plot points. Because of that, I decided to do a video on Jujutsu Kaisen and its first season. Keep in mind, there will be no manga spoilers ahead, so even if you're anime only, you can watch safely. I personally don't agree that a mediocre series with just good animation would do this well, as seen in God of High School's case, and that the success of JJK lies in a lot of other things it does really well. I also think that sometimes people either don't notice some charms of a series, or it's just not their type of thing, but overrated is an easy criticism to throw at something, especially since it usually boils down to people are liking this more than I do and I can't accept it. Of course, opinions are subjective, so keep that in mind as we go through this video. I'm not trying to present anything said here as an objective truth, nor am I trying to say that I'm the one who's right while others are wrong. I just want to give the first season some analysis and provide some points as to why I personally think it has been so successful so far, and why the manga is continuing to sell amazingly well. As I analyze the series' first season, I might also make some comparisons to other series. By no means is this an attempt to ever discredit another series. I just think that comparisons are good for analysis and discussion. With all that being said, let's get into the meat of it. I'll actually start from the thing that is praised the most, even by the detractors of the series. Of course, the animation quality cannot be denied. However, in my opinion, a lot of the scenes are carried not only by the animation itself, but by the flow of the action and the panels appearing in the manga. Action scenes which consist of random explosions, punch barrages, and flying or jumping around all the time, for most people are not as enjoyable as battles with clear choreography, memorable moments, and interesting techniques. The manga as a whole is extremely good with this, so good that in fact I'd say the animation sometimes falls behind some action scenes as presented in the manga. For example, during the Sister School event, when Itadori knees Todo in the face, the manga panel suggests it happening with extreme speed. It's sudden, like Itadori almost teleports to him, what looks very dynamic. The same scene in the anime has Itadori jog up to him, with Todo pretty much allowing him to grab his face and smash it. In the manga panel you can see the surprised look on Todo's face, showing that he wasn't really expecting to be hit by Itadori this fast. Same thing happens when Maki catches Mai's bullet. It looks very fast in the manga, obviously since it's a bullet flying, while in the anime Maki actually does a big wind-up with her arm before grabbing the bullet. Another example of this is during the Fushiguro vs Kamo fight, where in the manga, Kamo's speed is so extraordinary that when the pieces of the roof are blocking Fushiguro's vision, in the next second Kamo's already there, as opposed to us seeing him dash at Megumi. Of course, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with the animation. In fact, I think it's amazing. What I am saying though is that a lot of the greatness of the action scenes comes from how they are presented in the manga and how Akutami-sensei panels them, not just due to Mappa Studios' animation. The examples I show are in my opinion a bit of a proof that some of the manga moments are in fact unmatched even with great animation. So regarding the flow of action scenes, I'd say that it is a strength of the series as a whole. Suggesting that the massive, unbelievable success of Jujutsu is just due to the animation also kinda implies that the animation is like something we've never seen before in anime, and that's just not true. In fact, I'd say that most of the time the animation in JJK is not even as good as Demon Slayer's animation. And there are other series with great animated fights that have not had the same amount of success. Look at Fire Force or The Outcast, or even the mentioned before The God of High School. If animation and combat is enough to attribute to such a massive success, shouldn't all these series be equally successful? So the animation is really, really great, but it's not something that we haven't seen in anime before. so the thought that just this animation is carrying the anime alone is a bit ridiculous. Of course, the anime does make some scenes extended and more impressive than in the manga too, so it works both ways. In general though, I think that no one can deny that JJK's action scenes are great, which as mentioned is both due to the animation quality and the choreography of the scenes. Since even most people who think JJK is overrated like the action scenes too, I won't be talking much more about this. Also, for this one section, I kinda pitted the manga against the anime, so I'm sorry for that, but that's just because the animation is, well, purely an anime thing. So for the rest of the sections, I will be just discussing the series as a whole. I think that Jujutsu Kaisen does really well is setting the power ceiling very early on and having a power system that's reliant on technique and creativity a lot, instead of just brute strength. Of course we have absolute powerhouses like Sukuna and Gojo, but the amount of cursed energy isn't everything in this world. A lot of interesting questions and matchups might be considered. For example, would Nobora's technique work on Gojo since it hits the soul? Or can Infinity stop even attacks aimed at the soul? How would Megumi fare against Mahito? Does Idol Transfiguration work on Shikigami, or are they considered to not have souls? Since fights and conflicts are heavily based on strategy and techniques, battles are much more interesting, since it's hard to know the final outcome or imagine who might win. A thing that a lot of shonen manga suffer from is the infinite power scaling, which either renders some characters obsolete, or reaches the insane level where a story about ninja suddenly becomes a story about dropping atomic bombs on each other. What's more, in the case of, for example, Dragon Ball, since the fights are pretty much always based on character power levels and their amount of ki or training, later on 90% of the characters become completely useless. What could Yamcha, Krillin or Piccolo do against Perfect Cell? What could they do against Buu? When the only measure of who wins a battle is something like energy or power, the fights lose a lot of their nuance. In that way, JJK is very similar to Hunter x Hunter, which often features complicated techniques that can be used to outwit even much more powerful, in terms of strength, enemies. An example of this is the Yuppie fight, where the smart use of Morals, Knuckles and Meteoron's ability makes them close to beating Yuppie by making him go bankrupt, an opponent that was a few leagues ahead of them in terms of strength. Not only is this interesting for people who love imaginary scenarios, what-if fights and so on, but also seeing a character win thanks to a plan or strategy is much more satisfying. Of course, ultimately whoever ends up the victor in a battle is decided arbitrarily by the author, but to convince the reader, it's much better to show why a character won instead of them just punching harder and suddenly winning. It's also why people tend to get annoyed with the power of friendship trope, which makes characters win in situations where they really shouldn't, not due to their cunning or their battle plans, but because of a nonsensical power-up that gives them the edge. The techniques themselves are rather interesting too, which is important in a battle shonen. Let's look at some of the techniques. In our main cast we have a summoner done right, who uses his summons to transport himself, protect his body, and do things he otherwise couldn't do. I especially like the fact that he doesn't just attack through them, they can also be chained together for various effects, like Nue plus Max Elephant being lightning and water, or the bottomless well technique. Because there are 10 of them, there is also an aspect of suspense and excitement about what Shikigami might appear in the future, as well as making sure that more summons doesn't really feel like an ass pull, since it's defined in the technique's name. The fact that he has to exorcise them to be able to use them also makes sure that the situation where a ridiculously overpowered Shikigami is used by him won't happen. His strength and arsenal actually has to be earned. Nobora's ability is one of my favorite. It's quite simple but has a great design and many uses. Honestly, voodoo-like powers for the main girl of the cast is a pretty original idea. The voodoo power is usually associated with more villainous characters, as seen in Bleach, One Piece, Fairy Tail or Naruto. But her power isn't limited just to the voodoo doll. In a stylish way, she launches the nails with her hammer, also allowing to extend the range of the nail using hairpin. It's a very original style of fighting that allows her for combat at all ranges. Itadori gets the classic protagonist treatment with punches and kicks as his arsenal, which they even joke about in the story. But luckily, the way Itadori utilizes it is really satisfying, not only punching but also utilizing throws, elbows, knees, pretty much all of his body. His insane physical prowess makes him a joy to watch too, as in the running scene, or when despite his injuries, he barrages Mahito's face with headbutts. It's also interesting how even for a person with no technique, Akutami introduces elements like the Black Flash or the Divergent Fist to make the fights more interesting, visually flashy and strategic, while not breaking the rules he laid out for Itadori. For some other techniques, the 7-3 one, while very simple, well, essentially a critical hit when the strike is precise, is something completely original that I haven't seen before, at least in that exact rendition. Boogie Woogie is another technique that, despite its simplicity, is amazing to see in action, especially since Todo uses it in so many different ways during the fight with Hanami, switching with the opponent, switching with a friend, switching with a weapon, or even not switching at all and doing a feint. I'd say that this is a pattern with a lot of JJK's abilities. Simple at first glance, but very interesting with a lot of ways to use them. Mahito's ability is a good example of that too. Easy to explain or understand, but the applications are practically limitless. Just in the fight with Yuji, he grows wings, extends his arms, turns them into blades, drills. It's also interesting to see him gradually get more and more ideas on how to use it as he grows through battle, changing the shape of parts that are far away from him, assuming a form that is not similar to a human at all, and so on. During the fight with Nanami, he took more of a simplistic approach since he knew that he could kill with a touch, but the creativity was also not there since back then he was just learning about his body. So imagine how terrifying he will be with each next encounter. That's what makes the fights so interesting to watch. As a viewer, you're eager to see what other ways of using their abilities can the characters think of and how they can counter the technique that they're going against. And Akutami-sensei is a master of not only choreography, but thinking of unique ways to use the simple abilities of the characters. If we're talking about technique, we have to mention the pinnacle of Jujutsu Sorcery, the domain expansion, which we've seen 5 of in the anime right now. While not an entirely original concept, since it's heavily similar to Reality Marbles, and a bit to Yu Yu Hakusho territories too, it still has its original ideas as well. One of the strengths of this concept is how much it indeed feels like a pinnacle. It evokes a similar feeling that the early Bankai abilities in Bleach did. A feeling that the course of battle will completely change from now on. Akutami explains the concepts behind domain expansion during Gojo's beatdown on Jogo, and in the clear rules that the domains operate under, again, Gege's love for technicality in combat is seen. What's great about domains is how much they change the rule of the game. It's not just a new attack. The guaranteed hit means that the person on the defense has to adjust completely to the new situation, while the environmental buff provides a power-up to the owner of the domain. What's important, small technical spoiler alert here, it is stated in the manga that a domain neutralizes all techniques. This further proves that from the moment that the domain is deployed, it's almost like the fight enters its phase 2, since you cannot use your innate technique. Domains are also a beautiful sight visually, so it's something to look forward to. Since they're the pinnacle of Jujutsu Sorcery that is not attainable by every character, we don't really get used too much to them to stop caring about their appearance. By keeping the usage of domains to crucial moments and the peak of battles, hype is built whenever they're on screen. With so much versatility in the characters' techniques, the concept of domains and Akutami-sensei's knack for fights with clear choreography, Jujutsu Kaisen for me places somewhere at the all-time top of portraying the battles in a shonen story. And the reason why I'm putting this much emphasis on it is because at the end of the day, JJK is a battle shonen, so the fights are really important. After all, a great action movie is not only about the characters and the story, but about the good action scenes too. Sometimes in a sea of mediocrity, doing one thing good is actually enough on its own. Look at a movie like Raid Redemption and its reception. Is the story simple? Yes. Are the characters unique and complex? Not really. Does it do action scenes well? Oh hell yes, extremely well. And that's why it was received so positively. It knows what it does and it does it well. However, in Jujutsu's case, the action is just a part of it. Here, I'd actually say that the characters and story have just as much, if not more importance, so let's move on to it. This aspect of Jujutsu has been criticized a lot. Let's start with our dear protagonist Yuji Itadori, who's been called, among other things, dense, annoying, unlikable, generic, half-assed, as generic as they come, and so on. And that's just from the few Mal screenshots so imagine what else people are calling him in other places. Let me start by saying that him having a half-assed goal, and a shaky one at that, is one of the best things about him. What I'm gonna say now may come off as a bit of a diss to some other characters, but goals such as Pirate King, Hokage, number one hero, and so on seem incredibly unrealistic even for teenagers. Personally, in junior high or high school, I didn't really know any people who had a singular far-reaching goal such as be the best chef in the world, be the most famous YouTuber, or other stuff like that. I did know people who dreamed of going to medical school to save people though. I also knew people who wanted to help troubled people, so they did voluntary work. There's nothing strange with wanting to save people, and it's a much more believable goal for a teenager to have. Now one person says this: don't even question his characterization based on a grandpa that had less than 2 minutes screen time. If you actually think about it, it's obvious why Yuji would care about his grandpa's words at all. It is stated and shown that Yuji spends most of his time with his grandpa, and despite his bubbly personality, is a pretty lonely person otherwise. Yuji's conversation with Junpei shows that he also never had a connection with his parents, just a few faint memories. If a teenage boy who is lonely spends most of his time with his grandfather, of course he's gonna be influenced by his dying words. We don't need 5 episodes of his bonding time with Grandpa to understand that. And I don't understand being bothered by Grandpa's death in episode 1. It's after all the setup for the plot, which usually happens at the beginning. If you get mad about that, should you also get mad about, I don't know, Ichigo becoming Shinigami in episode 1 of Bleach? You need something like this to kickstart the plot and keep the viewer interested. The fact that being motivated just by Grandpa's dying words is naive, and the goal is naive too, is actually questioned by other characters from the very beginning, and Yuji's goals shift too. In the second episode, he's already told that Grandpa's words may end up becoming a curse for him, and he shouldn't live by someone else's words. Yuji then realizes that he's the only person who can be the vessel for Sukuna, changing his motivations a bit. This again makes a lot of sense, since a lot of people would be crushed by guilt if they were the only person that can save lots of people and they failed to do so. But here comes another important point. As one reviewer says, the goal of Yuji is acquiring all of Sakuna's fingers, the type of one he ate, so he can eat them all at once and sacrifice himself for the sake of humanity. This, however, ignores the fact that after the first finger, Yuji is not given much of a choice. If he disagrees, he will be executed anyway. If you can die after helping people or die right now without achieving anything, most people would choose to help. Especially given that if you gather the remaining fingers, you also get to prolong your life a lot during these missions. So unless you're already suicidal, that's another win. We also have this part. Did I forget to mention that he ate the finger just to save his friends? Oh, what a great guy he is, isn't he? No, Yuji is the most annoying character I have come across while being exposed to hundreds of shitty shows in my lifetime. First off, nice hyperbole. I seriously doubt that Yuji is the most annoying character you have come across, but okay. But another thing is, why is his action of eating the finger treated here as something heroic or as a mistake in writing? Yuji is a naive teenager who doesn't yet know the repercussions of eating that finger when he does it. I think the manga portrays it the best. In the manga, Yuji is very casual about eating the finger, both in his demeanor and in the question he asks before that. I just need some cursed energy, as if it's not a big thing. The point is that Yuji doesn't do a great heroic thing here. He does a stupid, naive thing that, while maybe useful in the moment, will have horrible consequences in the future. And the fact that it's a naive and selfish decision is also why Sukuna teases Yuji at the end of the Origin of Obedience arc. If it was not Yuji's decision, he probably wouldn't have to feel guilty, but since people are dying due to his choice to play hero, Sukuna can hit him where it hurts with his words. And I personally think that's what makes Yuji an incredibly interesting character. He's a naive, good-hearted teenager, but in a dark world, where his ideals actually get challenged often, and he ends up causing a lot of trouble with his decisions. This kind of protagonist is fun for a darker story, because throughout the course of the story we can learn through his actions that a good will or heart are sometimes not enough. It's the same thing with Yuji's unwillingness to kill. While it comes from a good place in his heart, it is also something that he eventually needs to get over. He accidentally kills a transfigured human first, then kills them knowingly when the transfigured children beg for death. One of the other reviewers says this: They try to force him in some kind of dramatic state that he must kill formerly human beings which are now monsters. It's so stupid because they begging him to free them by ending their lives. So what's the point in that? And the argument just makes no sense. Does someone asking you to kill them suddenly make it easy? Would you kill a child if it begged for it? A lot of people, including me, still wouldn't be able to do it. And also, character growth doesn't happen all at once. In episode 24, Yuji does just that. Kill a human being, well, half human, that did not want to die, and cared for his brothers too. After the kill, it is of course addressed for an interesting conversation about the necessity of killing. There, Yuji's growth is shown again. He accepts his feelings of guilt while also understanding that it was necessary. In this situation, again his ideals are slowly changing as he actually goes into the world and realizes that some of his ideas are naive. I think seeing a protagonist grow and also slightly be broken like this is much more interesting than a protagonist just as dark as the world, who's ready for everything. I also really don't see how Yuji is annoying. Throughout the course of the first season, he doesn't really disrespect others like some bratty protagonists. He engages in conversations easily, without awkwardness. He's honest and kind. In this way, he reminds me much more of someone like Tanjiro than some other protagonists who he's often compared to. He's also not as dense as some people make him out to be. He has a silly sense of humor and doesn't know much about the Jujutsu world which he is new to, but in situations such as bonding with Todo or his movie training, it's shown that he grasps some concepts very quickly and is quite talented. Another comment says, it's about an overpowered boy who was already overpowered in his past. Well, in the first place, he's not really that overpowered. He loses a fair share of his fights, and so far he hasn't made much of an impact on the Jujutsu world. And also, in this world, normal people do not have special powers, which means that Yuji, before eating the finger, was not overpowered just for the sake of being strong, but instead it's foreshadowing and an interesting plot point to be resolved in the future. What made him so strong? Why was it never made a big deal of in the past? Why was he noticed only now? What's more, Itadori's depiction as a loner is quite consistent. He's happy to make friends and talks to people very openly. He's uncomfortable with the idea of not clicking with someone, as seen at the beginning of his mission with Nanami, and in the baseball episode, despite realizing that just following his grandpa's wish is naive, he still admits to wanting to have a lot of friends that will watch over him when he passes away. There's much more to talk about Itadori's character in the entirety of the manga, but since this is supposed to be a spoiler-free video, we'll leave it at that. I do believe though that he's a pretty realistic depiction of a good-hearted, naive teenager thrust into a very tough situation, where he's trying to deal with it the best he can. Let's move on to the others. Megumi Fushiguro, another often misunderstood character, compared of course to Sasuke Uchiha, but also the target of general claims such as edgy, emo, and so on. One of the first things that separates him from edgy characters or ones that you could describe as overly dark is the fact that he's a genuinely good-hearted person that is not as selfish as he claims to be. Megumi is more of a person who rejects his own compassion and altruistic traits, but in his behavior it still obviously shows. Indeed, his way of saving people unequally, as he calls it himself, is very flawed and judgmental. For example, the argument, what if someone you save kills someone in the future, is a very bad one. Just imagine doctors thinking that way, and add to this the fact that you cannot predict the future, obviously, and if someone's character will change. But in the end, that's why Fushiguro became a sorcerer in the first place, to save people, whether unequally or equally. His motivation is an altruistic one. Of course, the fact that he became a sorcerer is due to the contract with Gojo too, but the motivations of Jujutsu sorcerers completely vary on a case-by-case basis, and Fushiguro's motivation as a sorcerer is to save people who he cares about. He does this because he believes it to be the right thing to do, and his trait of caring about people is present in the story from the very beginning. The reason why Yuji's execution is suspended in the first place is because Megumi did not want to let him die. Whether the reason for this is selfish or not, it still shows that Megumi can care for the life of a person he just barely met and want to save them, based on his judgment of Yuji as being a good person worth saving. Interestingly enough, fighting on behalf of others is also seen even in Megumi's flashback, although it's a bit more subtle. In this scene, Megumi beats up a group of delinquents who claim to not know what they did to him. Afterwards, we're shown a group of bully victims talking about their situation and their bullies. You might think, why is that shown? Well, I think that it's because Megumi beat up the bullies for them. That's also supported by the line that their exact bullies are the ones lying on the ground now. That's why the bullies don't know why Megumi beat them up, because he didn't do it for himself. And again, whether beating up a bully is a selfish or good decision is another topic, but it again shows that in his behavior, Megumi saves or helps other people. Even in his thoughts, Megumi wishes for fairness for good people, a very beautiful and selfless wish. Despite knowing that he's just a cog, he still continues with the work of a Jujutsu sorcerer, risking his life for others. He also recognizes his previous mistakes, apologizing to his sister under the Yasuhachi bridge, and wishing for her to wake up. As Megumi says, it's okay that his decisions are selfish or emotional, because these decisions still end up being saving others or helping them. He also at times cares more for the life of others than his own, as seen in the fight with Hanami. He thinks that his selfishness means he bears the least burden, and that's why he should fight even if he gets ripped apart. Against Sukuna and the second finger bearer, he also tries using a mysterious technique that is a danger to himself, not valuing his own life as long as the enemy is defeated. Megumi is a person who cannot see the good in himself, the same good that he values in people like Tsumiki or Yuji, who are people he wishes to save. The same good is also inside of him, but he's too critical of himself. Some of the coldness that is attributed to Megumi by some people as being edgy also honestly comes across as being a shy person and a bit socially awkward as well. In the Yasuhachi Bridge arc, he tries to go on a mission alone, not only to protect Yuji and Nobara from the danger, but also because, in my opinion, he underestimates what friendship really means. Upon seeing that they want to go with him, he doesn't protest any further, he just smiles, realizing how precious his new friends are to him. I also think that his slight awkwardness shows through how embarrassed he gets in front of his junior high school staff, although that might be because they remember him as a troublemaker. Nevertheless, Nobara, who at this point in the story already spent a lot of time with Megumi, also called him an unsocial person. I think that behind Megumi's gloomy demeanor hides a flawed but ultimately good-hearted human. He's not hell-bent on revenge, rivalry, or anything like that. His friendship with the other two is genuine too. Look at the way he notices that something is bothering Itadori right before the exchange event. Or how he brings Tadashi's uniform tag to his mother, even though he was unsure about saving him, but he did it for Yuji. After Itadori dies and Megumi has a small talk with Nobara on the stairs, he changes the topic in order to make her feel better. Then there is the cover of chapter 36. In the cover, Megumi's slight smile is seen, showing that he's genuinely happy about Itadori being back, especially considering how rarely Megumi smiles at all. He's not emotionless or a walking stereotype at all, but he's had a hard childhood, almost without any parental guidance, and he too has been thrust into a dangerous world from the very beginning. With a questionable person as his legal guardian, it's not strange for him to be a more reserved person who's been on his own for a large part of his life. This also explains why he's less likely to joke around and more likely to keep his cool. After all, there hasn't been much happiness in his life so far. Throughout Season 1, we gradually watch Megumi grow, accepting the opinion of others like Itadori, while also following the path of his own conscience and deciding to save people selfishly. It's interesting that Megumi considers himself to be a selfish person, but actually, his lack of selfishness, so his willingness to die and sacrifice himself, is something holding him back, which gets resolved in the Origin of Obedience arc, with him remembering both Gojo's and Sukuna's words. Be greedier, Gojo says, telling him that it's okay to actually be selfish. It's only then that Megumi can actually grow. His flashback after the fight ties into all of the conversation that he's had throughout the season, about him saving people, about his selfishness, about good and bad. This makes the viewer really feel that his development is earned. It's not something that suddenly appears and is resolved in the same episode. And the best thing is that we see his resolve and worldview not only through his words, but in how he fights and acts too. He thinks that Tsumiki is seeing his shortcomings in a good light and accepting his dispositions, but it's a bit different. He is the one who doesn't see them in a good light. Other people like Yuji, Gojo, Nobara, Tsumiki, they always saw the good and potential in him. And just like Itadori, Megumi has to deal with the consequences of his actions too. Despite him being a good person, like I said before, his way of saving people is indeed a bit selfish and judgmental, and so his own words are turned towards himself in this case. Because he wanted to save Itadori, more and more people will end up dying, which is actually already happening. So Megumi also has to face the fact that his own philosophy doesn't solve everything and goes against another belief of his. Just because you save a good person doesn't mean that their life won't cause death in the future. Megumi originally said a similar phrase regarding Tadashi, with a naive view that saving a criminal means a possible death for someone in the future, disregarding the fact that saving good people can have the same outcome, because being good or bad is not like a status for your entire lifetime. The circumstances might change, and even good people can still cause death to others. Of course, just like Yuji, Megumi will get much more growth in the future, but for season 1 I think we've discussed him a lot already. I cannot agree with anyone who calls him flat or boring. It just feels like they absolutely didn't get his character and his growth. Kugisaki Nobara plays a wonderful, unique role in the main trio, being a bit of a contrast to the other two. I've seen some people say that she's the least interesting so far, and while I agree that she has had the least development, there's a good reason for it that seems often overlooked, which is that compared to the boys, Nobara already has a really strong personality, morals, and ideals. Let's start with her introduction, where she stays by her ideals and dream when questioned by Yuji. Now, compared to some of the other sorcerers, her goal seems at first much more mundane, with seemingly no grand wish to save people or the world. This is something that seemed very realistic to me from the get-go, a dream to live in a bigger city and leave the countryside. She hated the people who ostracized Sari for a made-up reason that Nobara knew wasn't true since they hanged out together. As Nobara says in episode 3, "If I stayed in that village, and the torn head of a doll is shown." Nobara knows that she could not be herself in that village freely. She would either have to adapt and behave like the rest, betraying her own character, or leave the village. And Nobara chooses to leave, not wanting to change who she is. She chooses a harder, more dangerous path of a Jujutsu sorcerer, just to stay true to herself. That's what shows how strong her character is. Unlike the boys, Nobara isn't conflicted by her own goals, and you may not see as much soul-searching from her, but that's because she's already done it. This can be seen in various situations. Nobara has seemingly not much of a fear of dying or just fear in general. When sucked into another place, in the detention center, not only does she not panic and just fight till the end, but right before getting swallowed by the big curse, instead of getting overwhelmed by fear, she instead tries to curse the curse in a humorously dark way. Compare that to Yuji's close encounter with death in the same episode, and it's easy to see the difference. Again, in the fight with the Cursed Womb's death paintings, she doesn't hesitate even for a second to pierce her own arm with nails, not caring about the pain seemingly. And again, she's not fearing death, because it's not that she doesn't think about dying at all. She acknowledges that she might die in this situation and just tries to take down the enemy with her. But one of the best examples of her already having her priorities set along with a strong resolve is her conversation with Itadori in the last episode of the first season. After killing the partially human brothers, Itadori feels compassion and grief. Not only does Nobara dodge Yuji's question about killing before, implying that she might have, but further on in the conversation, she directly says that it was nothing to her. She acknowledges her role as a Jujutsu sorcerer, and the fact that sometimes killing is a necessity, as well as her inability to save everyone. More of Nobara's life philosophy and way of living is shown in what she says then. She has limited space for people that she cares about. She doesn't want to end up worrying about everyone. Having a strong mind and certain people who she prioritizes makes her pull through in tough situations like this without any hesitation. So Nobara actually is already very strong mentally, with a clear set of ideals and a concrete goal. She's different from Itadori, who is not only completely new to the world of Jujutsu, but also ends up questioning himself and his own actions. In most situations, Nobara is very headstrong, the first to be combative, and does not back down easily because she knows what she wants. A great aspect of Nobara, though, is that she doesn't take her strength to the extreme where she would be unkind or needlessly abusive. She thanks Itadori in episode 3 and in the last episode, without making a big deal out of it or disparaging him. Through calling herself an accomplice of Yuji after they kill the Death Painting's brothers, She lessens his pain and makes him feel not alone. She was also visibly upset by Itadori's death, even though she didn't know him too long. Nobara was also willing to die for the little boy in episode 3. That, combined with her no bullshit, very straightforward and sometimes combative personality, is a mix that beautifully embodies her fragility and femininity, but also incredible strength and resolve. Nobara also has great respect towards Maki, probably due to Maki also having strong character and a clear goal, and she openly defends Maki in her fight with Momo. So again, going with her life philosophy of the open seats in her life, Nobara is someone who treats those close to her very well and genuinely cares for them, while being admittedly a bit more scary in behavior towards others. Her strength is seen again during her fight with Momo. Due to what happened to Saori, Nobara rejects the idea of ridiculing the more fortunate ones. She does not strive for perfection and she is a mix of beauty and strength. All these values are something she already has within herself. It's not something that she learns only now. Nobara is a complete person who can already protect her values because she believes in them so strongly. Though not that much of her has been explored in the anime so far, I think that she plays a wonderful role in the team. She's the one that doubts herself the least. The one that has it all figured out the most. Gojo Satoru. Let's move on to Gojo, the strongest sorcerer and one of the most beloved characters, not only in JJK but in recent times in shonen anime. He plays an incredibly important role in the story, completely different from some of the characters he's been compared to. To think of him as just the OP funny sensei is a misunderstanding of what he represents and who he is as a character. Gojo represents the pinnacle. He's pretty much the only hope Jujutsu sorcerers have against some curses. If it was not for him, the entire world of Jujutsu would look different. This can be seen anytime he's in action. Look at his fight against Jogo. Jogo, a curse so strong that he can set you on fire with just his presence, and his domain expansion is a literal volcano. If not for Infinity, what would have happened? When Todo and Yuji fought against Hanami, what would have happened then if Gojo did not break the veil just as Hanami was expanding her domain? It's not just about him being cool and strong. Without him, it would be a tragedy in many cases. Anytime something really terrible happens, like the Mahito arc or the detention center, it's because he's not there. Gojo to me feels like a perfect example of with great power comes great responsibility, since so much relies on just his shoulders. Even the villains acknowledge this, and all of their plans revolve around getting him out of the picture. So, compare him to, say, Kakashi is wrong, because they do not represent the same thing. There is no one who can stop Gojo, but because of this, everything depends on him and his actions. It's interesting to think about the state of the Jujutsu world before he was born. With his great responsibility comes, well, loneliness too, seemingly. Gojo goes against the elders, the conservatives, against the old order of things. Which means he has many enemies, people who outright hate him. He knows this too. As the quote says, it's lonely at the top. Looking at season 1 of JJK, it's easy to notice that despite seemingly being a lovely, funny person, Gojo isn't really surrounded by close friends who would understand him or help him. Some of the people from his generation somewhat dislike him, like Utahime, some respect or fear, like Ijichi, some are neutral, like Meimei, who he had to pay to make her do some job for him. But there's no one really by his side. It seems that Nanami is one of the people Gojo trusts and gets along with, despite their huge difference in personality. But regarding strength, Nanami is light years away from Gojo. So if you think about it, when things start getting really rough, there's no one at the top but him. And Gojo knows this too, so he tries to gather powerful, reliable, good allies with whom he will be able to rebuild the rotten Jujutsu world. Gojo is obviously aware of his own power, since he's very cocky about it, but he does know about his role and responsibility too. So he doesn't just go on missions and live a carefree life, but he devotes his life to building up the new generation, looking for hope and power in cases such as Yuji's, willing to risk it and suspend his execution to give him a chance to grow. This again makes a lot of sense. If Gojo, who's the only person at the top, eventually passes away, who will be there to replace him? I believe that is also why he mentions to Principal Gakuganji that a wave is coming, of something more than special grade. This is what he's aiming for, a world that is safe even when he is not around. In a way, he's also similar to Yuji, strangely. In episode 2, Yuji mentions how he would regret if he did nothing to stop Sukuna, since he is the only person that can do it. Gojo is in a similar situation. There are many things that only he can do, as he is Gojo Satoru. So, thinking about this, every day he bears a huge burden of responsibility on him. And let's not forget that he's just human. He's a 28-year-old human. He might seem to us like a god through his abilities, but such a huge burden lies on the shoulders of one person. Regarding the loneliness aspect, I think that's also why he explicitly tells Megumi that you always die alone. I mean, after all, even if you pass away surrounded by friends, you're the only one who's actually dying and leaving this world. But I really think there is a bit more meaning behind it, since Gojo has probably seen much death during his Jujutsu career, and he's been lonely for most of the time too. That's why he's, as he puts it, greedier. I think another very interesting part of it is how unhinged he can be. This is seen primarily in battle, in how completely ruthless and brutal he is, or in his stare with absolutely no mercy, but also in some of the things he says. The fact that he openly says that he could kill the elders, but he doesn't want to, means that he's already considered it and made that decision. To even consider killing them shows that Gojo can be a quite crazy person. It's interesting to see how he has a slight personality switch when the headband or blindfold is off. This might be reaching a bit far, but with his blindfold on and his hair up, he usually displays most of his goofy, uncaring and cocky persona. When the blindfold is down though, it usually means business and another side of Gojo comes out. It's almost like a part of his character is just a persona, a front of the strongest, behind which hides much more. I say this because I think that there are many cases where Gojo goes overboard with his jokes and personality, and I believe he's quite aware of that, but it's a bit of a play that he continues to act out. I think that he's a quite complex character, and behind his goofy behavior, a lot of trouble, pain and burden hides too. It's just that since he's the only one at the top, there's no one to really share the burden with. That could also be why he's searching for strong allies. Something that also makes him much more human is the fact that he's not an ideal or perfect teacher. He's outright wrong at times, as seen with Gojo being wrong about Sukuna's fingers acting like a radar, and at other times, he just doesn't seem to tell his students much. This is seen especially with Yuji, who had to learn a lot of important jujutsu things from others. Part of it might be tough love though. I can promise you one thing though, you're gonna love Gojo even more in the upcoming seasons. Please don't think of him just as funny OP character, because there's much more to him than that. In my opinion, one of the strongest aspects of JJK is the supporting cast. In many series, even if I enjoy the plot, I find it hard to find many characters I would end up loving. But there's so many of them in JJK though. One thing that it does exceptionally well in my opinion is turning simple or seemingly one-dimensional characters into much more fleshed out ones, sometimes turning tropes on their head. For example, Todo, seemingly a big dumb musclehead, actually turns out to be a very profound person with fantastic understanding of cursed energy and the flow of life and so on. But even before he became a lot of people's favorite through his fight with Yuji, he already showed that he's more than muscles when he refused to go along with the plan of killing Itadori during the exchange event. Of course, the reason he gives is mainly Takada-chan's show, but upon learning more about him later, it's easy to see that Todo is not the type of person who would resort to underhanded tactics like that. He might be violent and dense at times, but it's seen in what he says and how he acts that he likes a challenge and he would have some respect for himself as well, so he would never resort to tactics like that. Nanami starts off as the type of character who might seem annoyingly strict and cold towards others, never breaking a smile, but it quickly turns into a rare sense of responsibility, an anime adult who actually recognizes that the kids are still kids. He doesn't want them in the middle of danger, since he believes that it's the job of an adult to protect the children. For a viewer who sees the characters as powerful sorcerers, this might be annoying or strange, but in reality, they're indeed 15-year-olds, and it's not weird for a man with a good heart to want to protect them. What I like about his attitude towards children the most is that he's not disrespectful. He doesn't treat them as stupid brats, it's just that he believes he has a duty to protect them, but as he says himself, being a child is not a sin. Nanami is a troubled person who seemingly is trying to reconcile his sense of doing good with his wish of living a peaceful life with money. He doesn't claim to like his job, but he's drawn to it out of some sense of responsibility, or because he cherishes the gratitude he's been given by people. His attitude towards job or working overtime is also very relatable for a lot of people watching the show. He's a conflicted, very human character. He tries to stay serious on the job, but wipes the tears of a transfigured human. Then he takes the time to talk with Itadori about his beliefs and resolve after the mission, acknowledging him too. So he takes the time to remember his own words where he didn't acknowledge Yuji, just to acknowledge him later. He feels like a jaded character with a gold heart done just right. And also his design is incredibly cool. It's the same with the Kyoto cast. At the beginning they seem very simple, but all of them have been given care, personality and more nuance. The wooden robot is actually a suffering teenager who wishes for nothing more but a normal body. The unpleasant sister is a deeply hurt girl who felt betrayed by her sister and is stuck in a toxic family who does not value her and her weak technique. All of them have been given backstories that are not only compelling but also resonate with the backstories of other characters, making their conflicts more interesting. The principal, hated by most of the fandom, he's a character that can be understood as well. We sympathize with Itadori as the viewers, but he's indeed an obvious danger, and it's not strange that for someone from the older generation, Itadori being alive is just Gojo's whim. While he uses underhanded, terrible tactics to get rid of Itadori, all of which fail in the end, he says the truth in his conversation with Yaga. He doesn't hate Itadori himself. But under Jujutsu laws, he should not exist. This sheds some light on the conservative Jujutsu world too. They follow the rules without considering an individual's fate or trying to take risks to change the situation. I think that him being so proactive in getting rid of Itadori is also really fun to watch, as it shows that in his own twisted way, he's also very involved. He's not just letting Itadori, the vessel of Sukuna, roam freely, but he actively tries to find ways of killing him. When it comes to the second years, they are also more than they seem at first. Panda, who at first glance is a comic relief character, in many situations turns out to be the most sensible one, ideally balancing goofiness with a serious personality. He's the first one to comment how the exchange event turned into a fight between sorcerers. He also takes the time to talk to Mekamaru after the fight instead of just beating him and leaving. He is also shown to be quite strategic, bluffing the position of his course, asking Yuji about what he can do for the team, and taking the time to actually exercise spirits during the exchange event. In the end, it seems fitting that anytime someone asks about him, the answer is just, he's a panda. That's not the only thing about him. That's not the thing that defines him. He's an actual interesting being with his own personality. Inumaki also seems just like comic relief, with his own simple way of speaking. So we watch the character for his actions and in the case of the anime, the tone of his voice. We see his brave personality, how he still sacrifices himself for others in the fight with Hanami, despite Kerr's speech taking a heavy toll on him. His funny personality with a penchant for jokes or trolling is also shown through how much gibberish he speaks in his special language, since it was confirmed by Akutami that pretty much only salmon and fish flakes mean something. He's a pretty mysterious student that we don't know much about yet, but introducing him gives an interesting character that can be presented and shown to us through his actions and behavior rather than through what he says. And given how popular he has been among people, it seems like this is working. The villains. Let's face it, in a battle shonen or any story that is kinda good versus evil, the quality of villains can make or break the show. In the case of Jujutsu Kaisen, it definitely makes it. Starting from Sukuna's immense charisma, which captivated the viewers from the end of the first episode already. A lot of his charm lies in how much he feels like a person who just does what he pleases. His end goal isn't always murder and destruction. He shows genuine interest in Megumi and has plans going beyond killing as evidenced by his pact with Yuji. Sometimes he causes despair and pain, for example laughing at Yuji with Mahito after Junpei's death, only to moments later save the day, striking Mahito almost fatally. Not out of a desire to help someone, but because Mahito ignored his warning and touched him twice. In this way, he feels like a villainous Gojo, a powerful, cocky individual with immense knowledge and his own plans. Because he seemingly does what he wants, it's always interesting to watch him, because there's no guarantee what he'll end up doing. I mean, he was crazy enough to kill Yuji by ripping his heart out, not caring about the fact that he might lose a part of his powers that was in the fingers. In the same fight, he also played with Megumi instead of immediately killing him, just to see how powerful he is. I think a great thing about him is also how rarely he appears. A whole arc might pass by without him making an appearance, but then when he shows up, it's never meaningless. It makes his time on screen much more enjoyable through keeping the viewers starved for him. Also regarding his presentation in the anime, they couldn't have picked a better voice actor for him. He adds so much to the swag and charisma that he has. Of course, it's impossible to talk about the villains and not mention our wonderful villain group, the Disaster Curses plus Ghetto. Villains who chill on the beach, play life, go to hot springs together, and seem to just, well, love the villainous life. It's no surprise considering that, as curses, being against people is literally their nature, and while all of them have the nature of a curse, it's interesting to see how different they are in personalities and behavior. Mahito, the curse representing humans, is a fascinating villain. At first glance just an edgy murderer, he actually has a greater depth to him, and grows just like a protagonist would, so that the viewer can watch his progress along Itadori's. As a child curse, he's very curious, treating some people as toys and experimenting on them, playing with their lives to see the outcome. For him, it's interesting to watch people die and struggle. Even after he's almost killed by Sukuna, he still wonders how he could break Yuji next. He openly admits to being delighted by battle, hurting and killing, and actually encourages the other curses to do the same. His growth is shown wonderfully through battle. At the beginning of his first fight with Nanami, Mahito pretty much just tried to touch Nanami with his hand to activate his technique. Later on though, he starts attacking using the humans, still keeping his own shape. Then he changes his own legs towards the end of the fight. But the next time we see him fight, he's on another level, turning his arms into wings, sights, drills, transfiguring the already transfigured parts, turning into a ball of spikes, turning into a child. Even during that fight, he still thinks how he can improve and thinks of more ways to attack, commenting for example on the drawbacks of overextending himself. With each second, he becomes more dangerous as his curious personality finds more ways to transform, more inspiration for murder, as he calls it. In his fight with Yuji and Nanami, he even manages to achieve domain expansion, the pinnacle of Jujutsu sorcery. It's interesting that despite an absolutely evil personality, he can actually be pretty good at conversations, getting along with others as well as successfully manipulating Junpei. He's also surprisingly thoughtful, analyzing his own plans and what he did wrong in the onsen with the rest of the villains. After touching Sukuna's soul, he quickly comes to the conclusion that Sukuna is very valuable, while also noticing how it contradicts with his own desires. Again, a very human trait. His thoughtfulness also shows in his conversation with Junpei, where he presents his own view on life. A pretty nihilistic one, claiming that life has no value and also saying that the soul and the body are one and the same. While Mahito was deceiving Junpei, I believe a lot of what he told him was completely true. Both in his conversation with him and when talking to Hanami, Mahito seems to be a supporter of doing what you want without limiting yourself. Freely killing, freely having fun, whatever you want. In any case, Mahito seems to give a lot of thought to his nature and behavior, which is quite complex for a character of this type. While Mahito may not be a completely original type of villain, his extremely versatile ability, coupled with his curious, unrestrained personality and his way of toying with people through various plans makes him a joy to watch. It just makes a viewer wonder, what will this bastard do the next time he's on screen? Him being extremely hateable serves its purpose well, since he represents the hatred and fear of humanity, and since he is a villain. Jogo, a much older curse, has a completely different personality. Very quick to anger, grumpy just like an old man. He considers him and his allies to be true humans, and thinks positively about negative emotions that he was born from, considering to be more real. This shows a bit of a grey morality in the world of Jujutsu. While the curses are of course villains to us, they consider themselves to be humans, and hating the actual humans is also their nature. So it's not like they choose to be evil, because they cannot really help it. If we do not hate predators for eating the herbivores, should we hate curses for acting along with their nature? With Jogo's anger comes recklessness fueled by his immense power, which causes him to completely lose to Gojo. Jogo feels fun to watch as a villain, because despite his incredible strength and his terrifying introduction, he quickly gets clowned on by Gojo, and later, due to his overly prideful and irritable character, he actually provides a lot of comic relief. He hasn't appeared too much in the anime yet though. Regarding Hanami, she also appears to grow, learning through Mahito's words and the fight with Todo and Yuji to actually enjoy fighting. Because she is supposed to not kill the students, she later comments on how hard it was to stop her killing intent. Her claims to want to save the planet, along with comments about her being close to a natural spirit, raise the question about what kind of spirits are there in the Jujutsu world. While also enjoying killing and being an inherently evil being, she is again different from Mahito or Jogo, being a very calm, composed individual, not speaking much as well as being quite sneaky and careful, as seen when she retreats as soon as Gojo breaks the veil. This is a nice contrast to Jogo's recklessness, which puts him in trouble. All in all, the group of villains grow alongside the protagonists while also scheming all the time, gaining new allies and preparing for the big plan of sealing Gojo. And along with them is Geto, the one whose plans are a mystery. He has disdain for the cursed spirits seemingly, but still allies with them. He doesn't want to be seen by the school and operates from the shadow, never being close to the action so far. Him being a human scheming with curses, as well as his intelligence and huge knowledge about the Jujutsu world, makes him very interesting to watch, since a lot of speculation can be done about his plans. He's like the opposite of the curses. We know their actual nature, we know what they want, since they speak about it openly. But we know nothing about Geto. It balances the group of the villains by introducing an enigma within them. Even for supporting villains, backstories and personalities are given. Kechizu and Eso really care for each other as brothers, having spent so many years with only each other's presence around. This is not just something that is stated through words. Their bond is actually shown. Eso is willing to deactivate the technique that gives him an advantage just for a chance at saving his brother, while Kechizu screams for his brother in his last attempt to kill Nobara. In a short flashback we're also shown why the brothers allied with the curses. They're part human, so being evil is not just their nature. It's just that their goals align more with the cursed spirits. Every villain has some sort of goal, a purpose, just like the good guys. It makes it so that you can even root for them or be interested in what they want to gain. What makes their goals so interesting to watch is their dedication to the cause, to the point that the villains don't even care if it's them who will be alive in the end, as long as their goal is reached. When every character has some kind of purpose or a goal, it's much more interesting to watch their conflicts. I could talk about the characters much more, but there's still so many aspects to talk about, so let's move on to one of the biggest ones. Plot, foreshadowing and dialogue. A criticism I've seen a lot is that the plot so far is very simple and nothing special. Well, to that I'd say that it's all in the execution and how the plot and themes are carried out, not just in how original they are. It's hard to make an original story now. Everything is in some way derivative, touching upon themes that have been touched upon 1,000 times before. Give me an incredible plot twist in a story and I'll give you the TV tropes page that lists it tens of times across various types of media. I'm not saying that a complicated story is bad. Rather, I'm implying that a simple one can be just as good. And that's because a story does not consist just of its twists and the big reveals, but of all the pieces and bits of conversations, the way it reflects on the themes of the story, the satisfaction from the foreshadowing, and so on. And there's a lot of those in Jujutsu Kaisen. Those looking for a very complicated, convoluted story that surprises you with each page might indeed not find what they're looking for here, but not every story has to be like that. And if you look beneath the surface, Jujutsu Kaisen sticks with you with its messages, thoughts, and spirituality, while also playing with its common tropes enough to have that breath of freshness, to hit the mark with its execution, even though it may seem like a derivative story. Find and consume 20 fingers of the demon inside you and then be executed or be executed now. Simple enough, right? The trope of the demon inside is not an uncommon one, but it's often changed either into a source of a great power for the person or a story about how the great evil becomes good over time. But in JJK's case, we're faced with a real absolute menace who not only does not want to get along with the protagonist, but he has absolutely no interest in him. To the point that he almost kills him. Itadori doesn't matter to him. He calls him boring, he doesn't really talk to him outside of mocking him sometimes. When he's in control, so far he's been a lot of trouble. And regarding the death of Itadori, it's a less common trope, but it's even more interesting how it's not used here as only shock value or as a power-up to the protagonist, but it's actually detrimental to him, as it allows Sukuna to make a pact with Itadori that allows him to take over under certain conditions. Tropes like that are either deconstructed or played with to create something interesting. In case of Sukuna then, we get an absolutely powerful and merciless curse who lives only for himself, and his only interest is the deuteragonist. Not the strongest, not his vessel, but an entirely different person who showed him something interesting. Things like that keep it fun and fresh by putting a different spin on the story and making the viewer more interested in the plot. Looking just at the short synopsis that I've given, another interesting thing is how, compared to a lot of shonen, the goal of the protagonist isn't really anymore his choice. He made a reckless decision when eating the finger, and now he's left with two options, both leading to his death, but one might prolong his life. Of course, Yuji has his goal of giving people a proper death too, though the point is that there is no sense of going on an adventure, an optimistic goal of becoming someone great. He no longer has a choice. If he was to disagree, he'd just be killed. His role seems more like punishment for his reckless action of helping Fushiguro in the first episode. That's just the synopsis though. Looking at the plot moving forward, we have an interesting reversal of roles where the strongest absolute being is actually on the good side, and we watch the villains play around him, even realizing that he's unbeatable and has to be sealed. So without Sukuna, who is still not free, there's no big bad actually. There's big good, who needs to be taken care of. To see how a group of much weaker villains try to scheme to get him out of the picture is super fun. It showcases also how the villains don't take matters lightly and highlights Gojo's unique role as a pillar in the world of sorcery. A fair bit of foreshadowing keeps everything interesting. At this point we already know there is a traitor within the schools. This provokes a question: who and why? After all, the curses are pretty much chaotic evil. So what incentive could there be for working with them? Next, what is Geto's plan? Again, we know that he is someone the school might recognize. He also knows a lot about them and has some plan, but for what? He doesn't seem like a chaotic force such as Sukuna or Mahito, nor does he seem like a bloodthirsty person, so what does he have to gain from all of this? Why was Itadori so strong even before joining the world of Jujutsu and consuming the finger? What did his grandpa want to tell him about his parents? How did Sukuna even become a curse? Why can Itadori be his vessel? And what got Sukuna so interested in Fushiguro? So many questions to be answered, set up for future arcs, foreshadowing. It's to keep the viewer interested at every point. Plot points do not appear suddenly out of nowhere in Jujutsu, instead they're always foreshadowed and being given proper setup. Another bit of reversal or deconstruction of a trope regards the actual Sukuna fingers. Hearing about the premise of the show, one might think that it will have a structure of going from finger to finger, each one of them also being a power-up for Itadori. Meanwhile, a large chunk of the story, like the versus Mahito arc or the Kyoto exchange event, does not even concern the fingers at all, and in the case of the Origin of Obedience arc, the finger is actually a surprise to the protagonists. Moreover, Itadori is even told to not eat the finger, which Sukuna does for him instead for the second time. With those fingers, it doesn't seem like Itadori is gaining Sukuna's powers at all, and he's also closer to his execution. There's also the question of how much more can he take. The fingers seemingly come at completely random times, with the story not really being centered around them too much. Sukuna is valuable to the villains too, but they're focused on seeing Gojo more for the time being. It just seems like the main protagonist is not that important so far. He's thrust into this world and doing pretty fine, but things are not revolving only around him, which is refreshing to see, since he's not the hero that saves the day, and he shouldn't really be, as he's neither strong enough nor does he have any impact at the Jujutsu world yet. It feels like the series treats him rather fairly, as one of the important players in the whole game, but not as an all-powerful being without whom the good guys have no chance of winning. Regarding the construction, it's funny to see how the rather typical school theme of some shonen series is completely disregarded here. The students are never shown attending any classes, and even scenes of them casually training are very sparse. School in the Jujutsu world seems to be more about being sent to horribly deadly missions full of tragedy and danger, which again makes sense. It's mentioned that they're short-staffed, and curses seem to be lurking around every corner. They are super powerful humans who save people. It's a no-brainer that we get to see them in the field, risking their lives, instead of focusing on maths and PE classes. Some of those tropes seem basic or overplayed at first glance, but they're subverted or given a fresh spin, and even when that doesn't happen, it just seems like they're executed in the right way. Like the explaining power to your opponent, the anime classic. Here it can give a boost to the strength of a technique, which is a great explanation as to why the character should be explaining them, as well as introducing more strategies. Should you explain the technique and get a boost, or keep it a secret? When a technique seems awfully convenient, well, that's because it has a huge drawback to balance it out, as seen for example in the anti-Gojo Satoru veil. Binding vows to allow characters to form actual pacts that can serve as plot points, which force you to go along with them. Many things that we could see in other shonen anime are explained in Jujutsu in this technical way and given background so that they make much more sense when we see them. While the actual plot is of course kept fun through those means which we discussed, another strength of Jujutsu storytelling is its themes and how they're handled, so let's move on to them. Of course, in a series which starts from a grandfather's death, and where the end goal is Itadori's execution, one of the main themes is death. Death is explored in Jujutsu in a unique way. While most series contain scenes of death or passing away, JJK puts much more focus on it. In a way, in its dark world, death is used as motivation, as fuel, not only for Yuji in the beginning, but also for Megumi and Nobara after Itadori's apparent death. Itadori's death is not only something that they have to accept, but rather something that they need to use as a source of strength in order to not let that happen again. As a human living a normal life, Itadori's view on death at the beginning is quite naive and flawed. He believes that there is a proper death and also deaths that are not right. This makes sense in the context of the story. At that point he's a child who hasn't faced death before. He believes that people can be guided to a proper death, but then reality constantly clashes with him. Megumi confronts him with his own philosophy and poses the question, what if someone you save kills someone else in the future? A seemingly proper death might not have the best outcome, and it might bring death for other people. Then, during the Versus Mahito arc, Yuji goes through traumatic experiences where he not only watches death through his own eyes, but he also has to do the act of killing himself. After Itadori himself kills and after his talk with Nanami, he questions this again. Is there a proper death? A natural one? Before, the thought of a good death stopped him from killing, but he faced a situation where he had to end some lives to save other lives. With Nanami's words of wisdom and what he went through, Yuji learns more about death. He is also faced with the reality that no matter how much he tries, he won't be able to save some people. With his idealistic views, he hopes for Junpei to join him and everyone, only for Junpei to be mercilessly killed in front of his eyes. Which again, serves not only as a source of strength for Itadori in that moment, but also as his motivation to get stronger. Since cursed energy is born from negative emotions, in many cases being close to death and in extremely dangerous situations is a source of power. Though death is final, sorcerers are always close to it. But interestingly enough, for the curses, death seems to be something different. As seen in their scheming, their main priority is not for them to stay alive. But despite that, death gives them strength too, as seen when Mahito unlocked his domain expansion on the verge of death. The concept of death also comes up in Yuji's wish. He wants to die surrounded by people. This contradicts in a way what Gojo says, you always die alone. But it also ties interestingly into the concept of cursed energy and regret. Curses can be born from regret and other negative emotion. Dying filled with regret might be a cause of pain for others in the future in the form of a curse. Yuji's wish for a death surrounded by friends is just a small piece of that. Because as Yaga puts it, Jujutsu sorcerers do not die without regrets. This is interestingly enough seen when Nanami fights Mahito. Though being so close to death, he is ultimately saved when he states that he has no regrets. Ironically, this just confirms what the principal says. There is no death without regrets. Why is regretting things a big theme in JJK? It's not just because regret can become a curse. JJK suggests a largely grey morality, where taking decisions isn't always easy since there's not a single best path to take. It's easy to regret an action that at that time seemed the best action to take, but actually had some tragic consequences. This is also a world where technique is not learned like in some other shonen series. Most techniques are granted at birth, whether the person wants it or not. So we can have regret of being born with a weak technique, regret of ever being born a certain way like Mekamaru, or regret of being born in a sorcerer family where certain burdens and responsibilities are automatically placed on you. Even the single act of coming into this world can be a source of so much regret. But regret comes up in most of the characters' decisions. When in the detention center Yuji almost meets his death, which again is a driving force in this show, is the first time when he really regrets the decision he made. When faced with the fact that his action of consuming the finger will cause the deaths of more people, both Megumi and Yuji are likely to feel regret, which is supported by the fact that they try to hide this fact from each other. Yaga talks about regret too. In the conversation with Gakuganji, he mentions that regret is something that not only the students will feel, while the viewer is presented with Geto's image, indicating that there are some past regrets for either Geto or Yaga as well, unknown at the time. JJK doesn't take the route where playing the hero always leads to good things only. It's understandable that as all-powerful beings, the sorcerers make decisions that will impact not only themselves, but other people who they save too. Since such a huge responsibility lies on them, it's no wonder that there's so much place for regret. And as Yuji says in another one of his goals, he doesn't want to regret the way he lives. Another theme of Jujutsu Kaisen is the clash of conservative and progressive values. This is seen most obviously with Gojo, who wants to change the world of Jujutsu. He's aware of the evolving Jujutsu world and is willing to take risks, like with Sukuna's case. In episode 21, when Gojo walks over the ants, they are revealed to be alive. It's not just a showcase of his power. That scene showcases Gojo's attitude. He doesn't want to crash the current Jujutsu world, although he could. He wants to step over it to go further. But at the same time, the very act of stepping on ants is a risk, something that could potentially backfire if Gojo isn't there. Literally, and symbolically, if not for infinity, the ants would have been crushed instead. Gojo takes risks to try and go further by finding allies and trying to fix the world instead of destroying it and rebuilding anew from the rubble. But this is not seen just through Gojo's struggle. Nobara's conversation with Momo is another great example. Momo recognizes the unfairness in the world of Jujutsu and how women are treated differently. She says that perfection is demanded from them and that looks are just as important for them. But while she recognizes it, Momo seems to perpetuate it too, talking to Nobara as if it's something that has to be expected of them and it's not up for change. Nobara, on the other hand, rejects this. She asks what makes us obligated to conform to these standards, and calls them absurd demands. She also respects Maki, who just like her, rejects the conservative values. Despite being at the bottom, Mai, as she says herself, hated Maki who was always going forward. She asks Maki why didn't she stay at the bottom with her? Why did she try so hard? She asks her what was so bad about being treated as a servant. Despite being a direct victim of the Zenin family's unfair treatment of women, she didn't want to break out of that cycle and hated Maki for doing so. Maki, on the other hand, not only kept persevering, but outright left the Zenin family. Despite having no cursed energy and not seeing cursed spirits, she was still trying. As Maki herself says, she became a sorcerer to piss people off and spite the Zenin family with their outdated sexist thinking. Momo and Mai might see the unfairness towards women in the conservative parts of the Jujutsu world, but they don't rebel against it. Nobara and Maki outright reject it and just like Gojo try to pave their own way. This theme of conservative versus progressive values can be seen with some other Kyoto students too. It's especially seen in the fight between Kamo and Megumi. Kamo has the most respect out of the students for the Kyoto principal. He also believes that just allowing Yuji to be a sorcerer is a huge problem, not willing to bend the rules. He feels that his position in the Kamo clan is also a reason why he cannot overlook this, which shows that Kamo genuinely believes that he has to act and think a certain way to be a worthy heir. Kamo has absolutely no qualms about using the whistle for the trained cursed spirit to kill Itadori. When told his orders by Gakuganji, he doesn't question them or rebel. Kamo claims to have sympathy for Megumi, since he believes he will be a pillar of strength for the three great families. He thinks the families and clans are still extremely important. He puts emphasis on how killing Itadori is his personal decision as the heir. This is in comparison to Megumi, who openly says about no longer having a connection with the Zenin family. Megumi, who is actually the one to ask Gojo about saving Yuji, showing how he doesn't stick to just the rules and is willing to give others a chance. But in this conversation, Kamo's thoughts are shown. He thinks of what he's doing as playing a part for his mother's sake. He has to be like a rightful heir, even if it means killing a person who is actually very similar to him, as we find out in their conversation during the baseball match. And that shows an extremely important aspect of this theme. They're all victims. Mai suffers due to the Zenin family's unfair treatment of women. Momo suffers trying to adjust to perfection. Kamo suffers because he's in a position where he has to act like the heir for the sake of his mother. Meanwhile, an honest and sincere good girl like Miwa suffers too through having to take part in plans like killing Itadori despite not wanting to. In Jujutsu Kaisen, the conservative world is not only unprepared for the coming changes, as Gojo puts it, but it's outright harmful to the students, who keep fueling it, either not realizing that they're trapped or thinking that there is no other way. Whether this is Akutami's comment on society, or it's just how the Jujutsu world is presented, it's still a piece of great world building that is presented from the beginning chapters and expanded with each arc. It's also interesting in the context of the bond between Todo and Itadori. Of course, they bond over their love of a certain type of women, with Todo living through an entire slice of life anime season in his head, but there's actually something else that makes Todo a good candidate for Itadori's friend. He's a rebel. Among the Kyoto students, he's the one who doesn't even listen to the plan of killing Itadori till the end. Even when Kamo later asks him to kill Yuji during the event, he says that it will depend on Yuji. During his first encounter with Megumi and Nobara, he cuts short Mai's smack talk and only wants to know who the replacements for Kotsu are. Though he is brutal and beats up Megumi, he does it out of his own wild desire to do so. Not only does he not seem to be trapped by conservative beliefs of some other Jujutsu sorcerers, he does things like openly loving an idol and asking everyone about their taste in women. So, things that might be considered not befitting of a sorcerer. Todo seems to not want to be bound by any rules, and this allows him to connect with the straightforward Itadori, whose existence outright breaks those rules. Notice how Todo never once mentions or asks Yuji about being Sukuna's vessel. He truly doesn't care. While of course his amazing strength is the result of training and good curse technique, I do believe that some of Todo's power comes from not being held down by anything. In the story, there's also a strong theme of duty. The Jujutsu sorcerers, after all, risk their lives for others as their job. Many of them are already born in a situation, for example a clan, where they have to exercise their duty and join the Jujutsu world. Others, like Itadori, believe that they should use their strength to help others, out of a sense of responsibility. Some, like Megumi, accept being just a cog of retribution. There's no place in this world for feeling like a hero, or believing that you can save everyone. Actually, in all the missions so far, there's always casualties. Everyone in the detention center was dead. Junpei and his mom both died as well. The Goodwill event also ended with the deaths of many people. Being a Jujutsu sorcerer who fights the curses doesn't mean that people will get to pass away gently, but that sense of duty is still something that made Nanami return to the Jujutsu world later. I believe that's also why, as stated by some characters, all sorcerers have to be pretty crazy. After all, some of them are teenagers who put their life on the line. Notice how despite being so close to death, no one during the Goodwill event is stopped by fear in their fight with Hanami. There's no one having second thoughts. Gojo even comments about how crazy Yuji is to fight curses right off the bat after consuming the finger. But that's how it has to be. A Jujutsu sorcerer is not a hero. It's a job with a duty that has to be carried out no matter what. Jujutsu Kaisen also explores dehumanization, which is quite fitting for a dark story. Of course, it's not just how frequent death is in the story, and how little these deaths are glorified, instead being usually quick and brutal with no fanfare or purpose, but it's also seen very strongly with Yuji. He is often referred to not by his name and surname, but by the word Sukuna's vessel, not only by the curses like Mahito, but also by other Jujutsu sorcerers, as seen in Gakuganji's reaction when Yuji is first revealed to be alive. That's also what Shoko says upon looking at Itadori's body. Some Tokyo students like Mai take it even further, referring to him as a half-cursed monster. In the same vein, Momo outright calls Yuji a curse in her fight with Nobara, and she disparages Nobara for even considering Yuji human. Gakuganji asks the students to kill another teenage boy. This is obviously a horrible thing, but through the use of dehumanizing language and telling them that Yuji is not a person, makes it so that the act of killing him can be considered exorcising instead. And it's just like Panda put it. To the Kyoto students, Yuji is just an object of fear as Sukuna's vessel. To think of him not as a human makes it much easier to go through with the act of killing him. Such dehumanization tactics have been used historically in real life, in slavery, genocide, or extrajudicial killings. Introducing this brings a very realistic and grounded aspect to the story. The theme of dehumanization also comes with Mahito's ability and his victims. They are transformed into horrific contorted shapes that do not resemble a human at all. But they still speak, even transfigured beyond belief. Shoko calls them ex-humans, while Mahito himself says that he doesn't know why they sometimes remain alive. Is it the consciousness? The brain? But if the body is what adapts to the soul, like Mahito says, and the bodies of his victims stop being human, does that pretty much mean that their souls also stop being human? So effectively his technique makes you not a human anymore, in a way. Mahito also himself says that life has no meaning, adding to the complete dehumanization of his victims. And then, with a situation like the Cursed Womb Death Paintings brothers, what are they? One might look like a disfigured corpse, but they're half human. They share an actual brotherly bond. Even though they're villains, we're again shown that appearance and whether you ally yourself with good or bad, that doesn't mean anything. Even they still have that aspect of humanity. And regarding humanity, the disaster curses regard themselves to be the true humans, so they believe the actual humans to be lesser beings to them. Not only is it a curse's nature to kill and commit atrocities, but they too consider themselves to be more human than those who they kill. So in Jujutsu Kaisen there is a common theme of dehumanization of the victims. The value of life in JJK can be really ambiguous. What about Panda? He's indeed a puppet stuffed with cursed energy, but he has his own personality, a consciousness. Mehamaru says that the concept of death is wasted on him, but is that really true? What makes killing Panda different from killing a human? Jujutsu constantly explores the theme of humanity in interesting ways. And besides these large themes, we have many memorable quotes, life lessons, and points of view peppered throughout the first season. Todo's Buddhist look at being one with life, Nanami's quotes about adulthood, Junpei and Mahito talking about hate and indifference, and other scenes. To call this a shallow series with no message is an outright wrong statement. You might not care about the themes presented, but they are definitely there. Humor, fun, and some other aspects. In the last section, I'd just like to mention how fun Jujutsu was. Of course, that's now a purely subjective viewpoint, but for me, who watched it with a group of friends together every week, it's been the most fun I've had watching anime in my entire life. The collective hype, laughing hard at the jokes, discussing the dialogue and themes. Of course, fun is not everything, and there's a lot of good media that makes you feel like miserable. But often when we watch something, we just want to have fun, and in that part, JJK delivered for a lot of people. It's also a really funny series. It seems to have all types of humor, whether it be absurdity like a lot of Gojo's jokes, meta humor like Yuji referencing other anime or real humans, or puns and wordplay like in some Jujutsu trolls. There's also a lot of physical humor, and comedy is sold by the voice actors' performances too. At the same time, the series also seems to avoid some pitfalls that annoy a lot of people, including me. For example, there's no fan service here and landing on girls' chests, nor is there any other perverted jokes. The fast pace, while annoying to some, provides a lot of entertainment with each episode to others. When watching with friends who are anime only, there were a few episodes when they were shocked to see the opening start because so much happened that they believed the episode is close to being over already. In the first season alone, so much stuff has happened regarding character growth, fights, plot developments. Jujutsu just feels good to watch for quite a lot of people, which cannot be denied looking at its popularity. All in all, I think that the first season of Jujutsu Kaisen has been a treat. Dismissing it as just a visual spectacle doesn't feel right. It has interesting themes, characters going through organic growth, and the plot is slowly building up throughout the events and foreshadowing. It's a position in the shonen genre that just feels executed right and fresh, through giving a spin on common tropes or deconstructing them. And the best parts of the story are still ahead. So what did you think about Jujutsu? Have you enjoyed the ride so far? What are your criticisms? What do you hope to see in the second season? If you liked the video, you can leave a like and a comment. I don't know yet if I will be making this channel a permanent thing, but maybe there are other anime or manga you'd like to hear my take on. If so, you can give me suggestions and subscribe for the future. I can also do a continuation of this video which would cover the whole manga up until now. I'll see if this video does well at all and keep you all updated. Hope you enjoyed it. And now, let's wait for the Volume 0 movie.